The Anglosphere has been the single greatest force for good in world history. It has shaped the modern world, but it has lifted the world out of poverty. It has more than doubled their life expectancy. The majority of the technological advances since the Industrial Revolution, which itself was a British invention, the first leap forward for 12,000 years for humanity since the Neolithic man first began to know how to do agriculture. Since the Industrial Revolution, where we've actually increased people's wealth 15 times over, we have essentially dominated every aspect of technological advances. You think of the Industrial Revolution, you think about the railways, you think about telephones and televisions, the internet, computers, the World Wide Web. But look at medicine. Vaccines were invented by the British, but 65% of vaccines are created by the Anglosphere. The majority of patents owning medicines done by the Anglosphere, but polio, insulin, the smallpox, everything you can think of that was a major thing, somehow the Anglosphere has been behind all of this. Why is that? Again, because of the institutions that were built up in the Anglosphere. We need to celebrate all of those things. Of course, also parliamentary democracies around the world. There are now 100 democracies around the world. Most of those have been inspired in some form by the Anglosphere. It's time that we stop the horsehair shirt wearing. It's time we stop the nihilism. It's time we stopped apologizing for the sins of the past and celebrated the fact that we are lucky enough to live in one of the 5 greatest nations in the world. It's something that we should be proud of. And if we stop the nihilism, then there's hope that we can actually look forward to those broad sunlit uplands.
Well, hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Anglosphere. Very pleased to be joined by a legend called Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, who is a royal commentator, who is a historian, and is also a senior fellow at the New Culture Forum, amongst many hats. Rafe is a huge advocate of the Anglosphere, of Kanzuk, of a country standing tall and free in the world, stood by its values of English liberty, the rule of law, and the importance of our culture. Rafe, thank you for joining us.
A great pleasure.
Now, Rafe, I firstly would like to talk about the fact you're of Canadian passports that you hold in your pocket. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm a dual national. I was born and raised in Britain, in London. I'm a Londoner, but I spent my teen years and my early 20s in Canada, my schooling, my university years there, and got a passport there. So I'm fully fledged semi-Kanzukian. I need two more for the entire ramp thing, but obviously many Australian and Kiwi friends as well, and have been immersed in all of this since I was 16, actually. That's when I first came out for Kanzuk, when nobody was talking about it. I don't think it was even a term used. I mean, the term goes back to 1967, but nobody in the 90s had heard of the term. And I came out with 2 radical ideas for which I was ridiculed. One, that Britain should leave the European community, and that Canada and Australia, New Zealand and the UK should form an alliance. And I was ridiculed. I said, you're a complete fantasist. Well, they're not laughing now, are they? Because it took 24 years, mind you, of ridicule before we got Brexit. And looking at the polling today, with a super majority in favour of Kanzuk in all 4 nations, and we've had party political leaders now endorsing it as well. You just have to be patient, and these things do eventually come around.
So if that's to say you're on the right side of history, Rafe, so of course,
always on the right.
yeah. So let's turn the clock back on the Anglosphere. We're going back to the American Revolution, where we saw what you have said before as not really a revolution per se, but more of a revolt of the rights of Englishmen. It was an English civil war. Is that correct?
Yes. So the Anglosphere, for me, I define as being only 5 nations: Britain, the mother country, and the 4 settler nations: America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And we're linked by heritage, we're linked by ancestry, we're linked by similar shared institutions. Now, some people may say, well, but America's not really like the rest of Canada. No, America is different. I like to say we're all a family, but America is a cousin. Sometimes it's a close cousin. Other times it's a more distant cousin. Whereas the Kanzuk nations are brothers, and they're the closest of brothers you could imagine to have. But actually, even in the case of America, one of the things that unites the five Anglosphere nations, of course, is also their unique outlook. So the Anglosphere nations have a very different way of perceiving the world. They are the most individualistic nations in the world. They are the top five most individualistic nations. That is the secret of their success. We can go later on into explaining why they became like that and why they became so unique. But if you look at all those countries, those five countries, they are the most stable and democratic. And they've also, and you can say none of them have had a revolution. France had a revolution. Russia had a revolution. So did China. Those were year zero revolutions where they wiped the slate clean and began again. The American Revolution was, as you said, a civil war, really. As the great 1960s comedians Flanders and Swan said, it was a bunch of Englishmen getting rid of a German king. I happen to like George III, but there's some truth in that. The Americans were really fighting to preserve English liberty. In 1608, you had the Calvin case, where this was after the 1603 Union of the Crowns. And it was, if somebody was Scottish, would they have the rights of Englishmen? That the crowns were united. And the ruling came out that yes, because of the monarchy, because of the crown, you do share those rights now. And the Americans said, well, we are just the same as the Scots. We want these English rights. That was at the core of what they were demanding. And unlike in this country, once they became independent, they entrenched those English liberties in the Constitution.
Yes.
The right to free speech, the right to bear arms, those all come from the Bill of Rights and so forth, etc. Our great tragedy, of course, now is those freedoms, unfortunately, are becoming less and less secure in this country. Perhaps we should have entrenched them in some way back then, as the Americans did. The only thing that's revolutionary in America is the fact that they did away with the monarchy and had a republic. But even their presidential style of government has British origins. There are only two forms of government around the world, major forms of government. One is the Westminster model, born in London, but also the American presidential system is actually British. It's based on the colonial system of government in the Americas, where you would have a British governor and an assembly together. And that governor, if you strip away his royal style and titles, was a proto-president in every respect. And so if you go to the American states, that's why you still have governors of state. They are the direct descendants of the British governor, the proto-president with the assembly there. So even the presidential system of government has a British origin too. But aside from that, yes, the American character may seem different, but it's almost as if America got from Britain's greatest exports in ideological terms, individualism, that cavalier spirit, that pioneering spirit, and put it on steroids.
Yes.
Or for America, they supersized what Britain had. That's why it's different. But it is different to Kanzuk. America is a very different country, and it was born out of bloodshed. And that, I think, explains to a large part the distinction between America and Kanzuk. And you can really see that if you compare America and Canada, because they have two peoples who are very similar in many ways. They sound very similar. They drive the same cars. They live in the same houses. They've got the same shops. They watch the same television, but yet their characters are fundamentally different. Canada, of course, is much closer to Scandinavia or the Netherlands. You look at, on liberal issues, look at things like gay marriage, and you look at drug use and so forth, also much more left wing. But look at gun ownership and look at that sort of thing. Now, I've always said that the American character was built through its expansion, through manifest destiny. That's how the national myth was built. We think of the gunslinger, we think of the lone cowboy, we think of those brave people going to settle the West, little families, the pluck of those pioneers. In Canada, it was very different. It was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police,
yes,
the institutions of government and of the monarchy. It was the Hudson's Bay Company, the oldest company in the world by royal charter. It was the Crown treaties that were signed with the native Indian population and the cooperation that took place there. So, and you can really sum it up in the Constitution of Canada and the Constitution of the United States. In the Constitution of the Americans, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In Canada, it's peace, order, and good government. And I think that's really summarized beautifully the different attitudes. One is much more bureaucratic and ordered, and the other one is much more about the individual. And I think that's because it is revolution versus evolution.
Yes.
We have evolved to where we are. Americans had to fight for what they have, and that's why you still have gun ownership there as such a key thing.
Indeed. How can we So it seems the Anglosphere is in a bit of a cultural crisis where a lot of its political parties are shunning its past, afraid and ashamed of the great achievements of our history, our institutions that used to be sound, that used to believe in its history and its heritage and its culture. How does the Anglosphere reconcile the fact that not only are we stronger together, and especially the Kanzuk nations, that it gets out of this self-flagellation and is proud of our great heritage from, the amount of times throughout history we were the first country, and of course along with our partner nations, to abolish slavery, all the way to the Second World War, where all the Anglosphere united against a continental evil. So how can we go back to celebrating this and having some confidence and pride in our history?
Well, we have to take back control of our institutions.
Yes.
To coin the phrase, take back control. We've had a long march through the institutions. This is what it's been a decades-long process, and it is a 25 to 30-year process to reverse all of that.
Yes.
In this country, the great tragedy is we should be halfway there, because we had 14 years of allegedly conservative rule, and instead of trying to reverse it, they put the pedal to the metal and actually advanced everything. So a concerted effort does need to be made to essentially, but this applies, as I said before, if the Marxist revolution was about seizing the means of industrial production, what we've seen now has been an attempt to seize the means of cultural production,
yes.
By which I mean seize all of those institutions that shape society's worldview.
Yes.
So the BBC, but the media more broadly, our museums and our galleries, our schools, our universities, our government, everything that has an impact upon how we see ourselves has now been captured and taken over. I like to try to tell people, I think the most important message I have for people is that Britain, but it applies to the Anglosphere, is now a post-revolutionary society. The revolution has happened. We are the counter-revolutionary. So these conversations should be happening on mainstream television. Instead, we're having conspiratorial chats like this. This is the sad reality of where we are. And this is a almost uniquely Anglosphere phenomenon, because this is unknown in Japan, this is unknown in China. Why is this happening? Because people call woke a mind virus, and actually it is. But I think woke is too wet of a term. I think it's better described as American Marxism. Now, it's not American in its real origin. It dates back to Antonio Gramsci and also to the Frankfurt School, Herbert Marcuse. But after the Second World War, the Frankfurt School came over to America, and they went in. They embedded themselves in some universities like Berkeley and elsewhere.
Yeah.
And that's where you begin to see the beginning of these woke ideas and concepts and terminology coming out. And then in 1968, you had a situation where the far left wanted revolution overnight, and a chap called Rudi Deutschke said, no, this is still a very patriotic country. If we're going to have a revolution in this country, it needs to be a long, slow
yes.
march through the institutions. And that's what we've experienced. Now, to reverse all of that will take 25, 30 years. You need to basically have another generation of people who are basically able to then infiltrate these organizations and just grandfather them out of the institution. But that is a long process. But in the meantime, we have new media. We've got places like this. We have in this country GB News, but there are other channels. We need to robustly celebrate the achievements of the Anglosphere. And the achievements are phenomenal. The Anglosphere has been the single greatest force for good in world history. It has shaped the modern world, but it has lifted the world out of poverty. It has more than doubled their life expectancy. The majority of the technological advances since the Industrial Revolution, which itself was a British invention, the first leap forward for 12,000 years for humanity since the Neolithic man first began to know how to do agriculture. Since the Industrial Revolution, where we've actually increased people's wealth 15 times over, we have essentially dominated every aspect of technological advances. You think of the Industrial Revolution, you think about the railways, you think about telephones and televisions, the internet, computers, the World Wide Web. But look at medicine. Vaccines were invented by the British, but 65% of vaccines are created by the the Anglosphere, the majority of patents owning medicines done by the Anglosphere, but polio, insulin, the smallpox, everything you can think of that was a major thing, somehow the Anglosphere has been behind all of this. Why is that? Again, because of the institutions that were built up in the Anglosphere. We need to celebrate all of those things. Of course, also parliamentary democracies around the world. There are now 100 democracies around the world. Most of those have been inspired in some form by the Anglosphere. It's time that we stop the horsehair shirt wearing. It's time we stop the nihilism. It's time we stopped apologizing for the sins of the past and celebrated the fact that we are lucky enough to live in one of the 5 greatest nations in the world. It's something that we should be proud of. And if we stop the nihilism, then there's hope that we can actually look forward to those broad sunlit uplands.
Absolutely, well said. I mean, there's so much hope. Common law, parliamentary system of democracy, and if we love America in there as well. You mentioned before the presidential system is obviously derived from a British governance system of the states. There's so much to be excited about. I mean, Kanzuk as a project has so much political capital across the spectrum, because to any liberal, well, this is something that you could potentially have free movement of people. The idea that an Australian doctor can work in Britain with the same qualifications recognised. I mean, it makes so much sense. Same language. The 3 pillars of Kanzuk, of course, is security, economics and culture, as defined by the Conservative Friends of Kanzuk. I mean, it is a no-brainer. And Rafe, how do we not only reverse the nihilistic Gramsciist long march that has occurred across the West, but build up the institutions of the Anglosphere? How are we going to quote Boris, build back better on that sense?
Well, as I like to say, there's no chance of winning the war on woke if you don't first win the battle for young minds.
Yes.
We have the most radically left-wing youth in history. We have never seen before on a whole slew of policy issues such a disconnect between the youth of today and those who are just 10 years older than them. For example, on the issue of the monarchy, for the first time in history, more youth want a republic than want a monarchy. And it's no surprise that we've got to this point, because we've had now a generation of children who have been indoctrinated through the teaching profession. When I was at school, there was a slight right-wing imbalance in the teaching profession. These were the guys who were throwing things at you all the time. Now, 90% of teachers vote for centre-left parties.
Yes.
Now, teachers do a great job for very little money, but when there's no balance in the classroom, and teachers not even being necessarily political, but kids pick up on things and they learn what's the right attitude, what's the wrong attitude. So it's no surprise that the radicalization of youth has happened at the same time that teachers have become like this. So I've proposed also that we need to completely change the way in which we train teachers, because there's no point having a good curriculum if the teachers aren't going to implement it, because we know that kids also are being introduced to terms like toxic masculinity, white privilege, white supremacy, not just at university, in primary and secondary schools as well. This is happening. So the change really needs to happen from the grassroots.
Yes.
Now, teacher trainers in colleges used to be very good. When they were independent, they produced teachers of outstanding quality. It's been ever since the university departments of education took teaching over that we've seen this switch to the left, because university education departments, after sociology, is the most left-wing institution in the university. I call them woke madrasas. That's what they are. That's what the persistence of what they are. So well-meaning teachers go in there, but they come out the other end completely brainwashed with all these ideas about critical race theory and gender ideology and everything else. So we need to change all that, need to bring more conservatives back into teaching. The Tories have good policies on this with the Troops to Teachers program, where you'd give veterans a second career in life, bring them in as teachers. They naturally tend to be conservative. They're role models as well. They're also figures of discipline within the school setting, but also bringing people from business, people who want a second career, who are tired of the rat race. There are programs for that already, but business leaders tend to be conservative, but crucially, they usually are very good at getting into the administration of institutions.
Yes.
And the left have always been good at getting in charge of who hires people.
Yes.
And if you can get them in, then we do have a chance of reversing that.
Yes.
Because As I like to say, conservative voters are dying off at an astonishing rate every year. They're not being replenished by the young. It used to be the case that, if you weren't a liberal at 25, you had no heart. If you don't have a brain at 35, you have no. If you're not a Tory at 35, you've got no brain. That's no longer the case, because kids are feeling let down. They're being indoctrinated by Netflix and everything else as well. But also, capitalism has failed them. So you need to appeal to them and give them a reason to buy into all of this, and then hopefully you will see that. But there's also a left-wing argument for CANZUK too. It shouldn't be the prerogative of the right or the left.
I think there is a strong critique here to say, we saw the rise of neoliberalism. That said, national boundaries didn't really matter. We should be a borderless economic unit. We saw in the 50s America say to us after Suez, right, you've got to decolonize. Your history is pretty awful. Here's a big debt bill from the war. And we essentially been trying to rebuild ever since with this kind of cultural decline. Now, it's interesting because our generation, the Zoomer generation, so to speak, have been politically let down by every political class. They've been let down by those, like you said, on the centre, perhaps the centre-right, where the capitalist model, as we speak, is essentially all the wealth is hoarded by one generation. And when it comes to property, that generation has imposed on huge levels of migration and cultural change. They've long marched those institutions like education. They've gone into universities. So it's been this kind of perfect storm of indoctrination, but also contempt for this generation. And now I feel more and more young people are excited for CANZUK because it's something to look forward to, something positive. Because a lot of young people, I want to do my gap year in Australia. A lot of young people want to be able to earn a salary there where 50% of their money isn't going to go down the black hole of the state. So I suppose CANZUK is the win-win. I mean, the young generation, Green Party are never going to endorse CANZUK, so the young should be, this is something we're excited about.
Everybody loves Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and the UK. These are all countries which everybody wants to. If you're from Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, you want to go to the UK because it doesn't seem like a foreign country. Because we aren't foreign, we are all linked, And so, but each one is so diverse geographically, culturally, as well as having similarities, that each one is going to benefit in some way from the experience of living in another. We're sport for riches. As if you want to have real experiences of a different life, which is also vaguely familiar, CANZUK is absolutely perfect for young people. And of course, obviously, each country has different skill gaps. And so there's a huge need for doctors and nurses in this country, which can be filled by Canadians and Australians, where there isn't such a gap at all. In fact, they have a surplus of these sorts of things. Now, suddenly, you'll have a place for British engineers and miners to go in places like Australia and Canada as well. So there's a great opportunity there for people to then move around and start to reconnect those historic links and those things that bound us together. Yes. We need to restore their sorts of connections. I'd love to see eventually some sort of common status given to us all, because for the majority of these countries' lives, we all shared a similar status. We were all British subjects. I'd say the majority of people alive today in Australia were born British subjects. Same thing in New Zealand. I would say about half of Canadians alive today were born British subjects. Originally, there was no distinction in the empire between anybody. You could be living in Christchurch, New Zealand, in Adelaide, Australia. You could be in Glasgow, you could be in Edmonton or Winnipeg. You were all equally British under the Crown. The Crown was indivisible. We were not foreign. If you were going from Canberra to Ottawa, you were still not in foreign territory. That's a lovely concept which we did away with in the 20th century. Because of nationalism on the part of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and because of our own misguided belief in the bureaucracy of Europe, and we turned the back on our friends. But that period is over. I think everyone can now see that in this era of great power politics, we are better together, to use another phrase. And people, as Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, has said in a very compelling speech, he said, in this era of great power politics, where the old world order has died, and we are now having to deal with Russia, China, India, and America, it's time for middle powers to get together when they share similar values and beliefs. And my God, there are no four countries on the face of the earth, not even Scandinavia, which has closer links and more common bonds. The great tragedy for British subject status was that it was done away with in the 1970s by Canada and New Zealand, 1984 in Australia. But I think it would be lovely if we had a common link that we could all say we now share this status. That wouldn't be British subject status, and we have 4 different kings now. At one time there was just one king, but the King of Canada could go to war with the King of Australia. They are different legal entities.
Yes.
But if there was some sort of Commonwealth realm or some sort of status we could have, I think that would be a lovely way to remind us of the things that connect us.
Well, Rafe, on that note, thank you for coming on the show. You've hit the hammer on the nail that Kanzuk is our future and something to look forward to. Thank you very much, Rafe.
My pleasure. Thank you.